What this webinar is about is developing effective student learning outcomes. And what is a student learning outcome? Very simply, a student learning outcome is defined as being something that students can do now that they could not do previously, a change in people as a result of the learning experience I assume you would be leading. Inherent in that conversation and inherent in this talk is also course design. So that will be a big part of this discussion as well, because I think these two things are very much intertwined with one another. So just if you want to talk, you can. If you don't, totally fine as well. You can share it in the chat or out loud. Makes no difference to me, whatever you guys feel comfortable with. So I just wanted to get a gauge of what do we know as a group about learning outcomes? What is it that, why did you come today? What do you want to know? Is there anything you're interested about? Feel free to share in the chat. If you know about the benefits of it, whatever it is. I am very happy to, kind of touch on whatever topics it is about this that you are specifically interested in. So I will give maybe 2 minutes about, in case anyone wants to talk. Got it. Okay, so Brittany says she's interested in learning about what SLO is and how you decide what to measure, and how you measure them. So that is indeed extremely important. And I'm glad you mentioned the measurement piece, because that is the key component to keep in mind. How you measure them, we will definitely talk about later, but that is a really important point, because we can't always quantifiably measure a learning outcome. We want to visibly see it, and we will definitely get into that later. We discussed the difference between a learning objective, learning outcome, and learning objective. From what I've seen, and Shami, correct me if I'm wrong, I tend to view those as similar concepts. I don't know if there is a distinction outside of semantics.
I'll jump in very quickly. They are used interchangeably. So if you're out there reading research about these things, you'll see people use learning objectives, learning outcomes. You'll see that in school. There is a small semantic nuance for those people who get really nerdy about this, geeky, and that is that a learning objective tends to be from the perspective of the teacher, my objective, my goal. And a learning outcome is a more clear idea of what is the result of learning. Noah's definition spoke to that earlier. So I would say it's not important. They use interchangeably, but if you really wanted to nuance it, one is from the perspective of the teacher, the other is from what the learner achieves.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so judging from those questions, I think this webinar will hit on these topics fairly well. So at least from my end, my experience as a student, and when I first started teaching, I kind of thought a learning outcome was just something I didn't think they were especially meaningful in any way. It's just something you kind of throw on your syllabus and you have to do it, but that's about it. So I wanted to touch on first why they are important. So first off, and I think this is one of the more important points, is that they really assist educators in designing the course and staying on track throughout the semester. And to elaborate on this point, is just your learning outcome, whatever it is that you decide is your learning outcome, that is where you want to go, essentially. What I mean by that, it's almost the destination on the map, the specific address that you want to go to. So your route to get there is the rest of your course. So in this way, it should anchor your course. Everything you do in your class should be to cultivate these learning outcomes. So in that way, it's really important to be specific about what goals you want to achieve in your class. Another kind of reason why they matter is it forces, when you sit down and you take time to think about your learning outcomes, it forces you to intentionally think about what it is about this course that is important and what it is that you want to cultivate. And as opposed to sometimes you just kind of get in the habit of, I'm doing research methods and this is how it's taught. Well, when we create very concrete learning outcomes, it forces us to sit down and evaluate that critically. So I think in that way, it's really important to do these thoroughly. From the student's perspective, and I think from student to student, this will vary. I know as a student myself, I was never too focused on looking at the learning outcomes, but for others, this may be more important. If I'm a student, I'm looking at the learning outcome, I can have an idea, a very clear idea about what the course goals are and what skills I should be able to develop along the way. And another reason why this is important is because by the students knowing where we want to go, it creates a clearer line of communication about whether I'm doing my job properly to help them get there. They know where I want them to go. What can I do to help them get there? Rather than just saying, I want you to understand this topic better, I can make that more concrete, and that can create a clearer line of communication between the student and I. And also, just to elaborate on this point, so by me being very specific, again, about what it is I want to cultivate, I have a better idea of whether they've reached that goal. So again, if I'm saying I want them to understand research methods more effectively, that's kind of vague. But if I say, hey, I want them to learn how to take a topic of interest and turn that into a hypothesis, since that's more specific, I can give better feedback about whether they've been able to do that. So again, this communication and then students kind of knowing where you're going and you knowing where you're going is some of the real benefits of creating concrete learning outcomes. A benefit that I did not know but learned about was, and this makes sense to me. So outside of the classroom, student learning outcomes are pretty important. So if you think about someone that's not in your classroom, how do they evaluate what you're doing in the classroom? And this is where they may look at your student learning outcome and say, okay, so what you're doing in your classroom is cultivating X, Y, and Z. So in this way, it forces institutions from an institutional level. So if you're teaching at CGU, it forces institutions to think about what skills they're developing in their students. So sometimes your department may give you SLOs, but keep in mind that you can add to those or you can cultivate your own as well. It can assist in demonstrating to both future employers and graduate admissions offices what skills your students acquired. And also in terms of receiving funding and accreditation from other outside institutions, they may look at your SLOs to ensure it falls in line with what they're looking for. So quickly, does that make sense to everyone? Any questions here? Just gonna stop for a second. If you do, throw them in chat. If not, I will happily continue. Okay. So worth mentioning is some potential, I don't know if pitfalls, but complaints about student learning outcomes. So if you, this is definitely more in line with if you are teaching somewhere and they give you student learning outcomes that you have to achieve. You may feel kind of stifled by your creativity stifled because they're giving you like, you have to achieve this and you have to do it in this way. And so to that point, achieving certain SLOs for some schools is a requirement. And kind of teachers can feel like this is more of a chore than like a fun journey. So again, that's pointing to the idea that your creativity may be stifled in the classroom. I think just to counter this is you may be given an SLO, but I think it's pretty rare that anyone says you have to achieve it in this way. So how you get to place X, you can get there through a variety of ways. So always keep that in mind. And then also, this is more about when we're actually creating the SLO. There is a big, there's a lot of people say you should use Bloom's taxonomy and some of these frameworks, and I'm going to go over that. But I do want to keep in mind that some of these frameworks, especially Bloom's taxonomy, may lack nuance or there's some complaints about it. So I'm going to present a variety of frameworks, and you kind of just, you can latch on to whichever one you kind of feel most comfortable with. Okay, so with all that said, I just want to make a few things clear about SLOs. All SLOs are, again, it's just a destination on the map you'd like to reach. So just because you have a strong SLO definitely does not mean you have a good class. It is simply where you want to go, and it facilitates your kind of planning process. Strong pedagogy is the vehicle that will always kind of ultimately take you to that destination. And just to go back to what I was talking about before, like your SLO should be able to express. So even though we want to get specific with the outcome we want to achieve, you don't want it to be so specific that can only be achieved in a variety of ways. So to make a kind of inclusive SLO, we want to make sure that it can be expressed in a multitude of ways or in several ways. So you want to develop the skill, well, you can do that through poetry, through a video, etc., through writing. So keep those things in mind throughout the process. Okay, so now that I've kind of given you the backdrop of all of this, I'm gonna go through the how-to section. And as I mentioned before, a lot of the how-to section is inherently tied with designing your course, because again, I think that's where the SLOs are really helpful. So to that point, one second. There we go. Okay, so before we even start, I think the most common mistake you find in SLOs as people are trying to create them is they are too general. So do your best to make your SLOs specific and not vague. So I'm going to give you kind of a framework that we can use as a checklist almost, okay? But I think from my experience, at least, the biggest kind of issue with them is they can be very vague in nature. So we're starting from scratch. We want to make it strong SLO. Where do we start? So I think what you really want to do is you want to start from the approach of backwards design, which is basically the idea of I'm building my course, and how do I start? So I start with identifying desired results. So what is it in your class that you want to build? What skills do you want to cultivate? So it's starting from where you want to go and then building from there. After that, you determine what acceptable evidence is, and then you plan your learning experiences and instruction. So when Brittany mentioned before that she wants to learn about how to kind of measure that, I think that would be in this planning phase. And I'm going to go through all of these three phases in kind of more detail, but this is kind of the big idea to start with. So here is a quick video that I think does a much better job of explaining backwards design than I do. So this is about 5 minutes long. So sit back and hopefully enjoy it. Let me get this going. Give me 1 second. Okay, give me 1 second because it is not playing on my end. So I'm going to get this up on YouTube. And sorry about that. Okay. Let me share the screen. Go. Okay, so again, this will be about 5 minutes.
5 minutes or less that support the teaching and learning of all students. I'm your host, Shelly Moore. Today's episode is called California Dreaming. No, just kidding. Curriculum Dreaming. Okay, curriculum, you know the stuff. It's all the goals and learning outcomes that society tells us we need to teach to the children. What I didn't realize was that it is really important to not just know the goals in the curriculum, I also needed to know how those goals in the curriculum were organized. Now, if you aren't totally immersed in education, you may not be super familiar with curriculum models and organization. But let's compare this to something that we might be more familiar with. I want you to think about the self-help book sections that support us to become our best selves. In many of these books, there are great strategies. There's one that's referred to that's considered a habit of a highly effective person. That strategy is called keeping the end in mind, or in education it's called backwards design. Okay, so here's the idea. You will have a better chance of meeting a goal if you A, know what the goal is, and B, if you make a plan to meet it before you start. So for example, if I had a goal to go to California one day, because everyone has a goal to go to California one day, the chances of me getting there will be way higher if I know where I'm going, when I'm going, how I'm getting there, where am I going to stay, how am I getting home. You quickly start to see how important the plan is if you want to meet a goal. But you also realize that there's multiple answers to these questions. In life and in education, there can be multiple pathways to the same goal, which is great, and it makes it responsive to the person who's trying to meet the goal. This is a much more effective strategy than, say, if I, for example, just decided to leave my house in Vancouver and just start walking north, hopefully finding my way to California. Backwards design is a strategy used every day, and it ranges from travel goals to weight loss goals. It's also used in many curricular organization models. But here's the thing, this is not a linear process, and backwards design is trying to aim to be responsive to the person meeting the goal. But curriculum is often interpreted as the opposite, very linear and not responsive. It's totally standardized. How I used to think about curriculum was like this. Curriculum is in a giant, big red binder, and in September, I start on page 1. And when I'm done with page 1, I move to page 2. And then I get to June 20th, and I have 147 pages left. Well, what if I told you there's another way to read curriculum that better aligns with backwards design big ideas? I want you to imagine that the curriculum is still a book, but the book is not a binder. It's a flip book. Do you remember these books? I love these books. The flip book, it's still the same for everyone, but how it's read depends on who is reading it. There are many ways to read the same flip book. So to make sense of this for curriculum, the first thing we need to do is understand what the pages of the flip book are. These pages represent the different types of goals in the curriculum. In British Columbia, we have 3 kinds of goals. We have content goals. These are the goals about knowledge. We have curricular competency goals, and these are the goals about skills and processes. And we have core competency goals. And these are cross-curricular goals that support the development of the people that we need to become so that we can be contributing members of the world. All of these goals are organized around a big idea. And these are the things we need to understand. Although the book is the same for everyone, the flip book pages we choose can reflect the kids we are teaching and can be responsive to both their strengths and their stretches. As educators, backwards design helps us to keep the end in mind by deciding what the goals are for a unit and how we can teach them in responsive ways that allow students to reach these goals in multiple ways. I think this calls for some professional development in California. Okay, teachers, parents, students, if you're watching this video, I want you to go find your local curriculum and I want you to look at how it's organized. If you're not in British Columbia, these goals might be called different things, but you will probably find that there's a lot of similarities. And then I want you to think about how we can start to translate these goals to students and families so that they can see what they're learning, because they're the ones who are meeting the goals. They also need to know why we're going to California. Okay, teachers, here's your job. And do this together. Number 1, I want you to go choose some goals that reflect your students' needs. Number 2, I want you to make a plan with multiple pathways so that all kids can meet those goals. And number 3, I want you to share those goals with students and families so that they know what the plan is. So that was our episode, Curriculum Dreaming. Head on over to the website to see some examples of plans and stay tuned for the video strategy about backwards design coming soon. Don't forget to subscribe to the email and the YouTube channel and the podcast.
Okay, so hopefully that makes the idea a bit more clear. I know if you have not been exposed to backwards design before, that may be a lot to take in. So feel free, I'm just gonna stop for a moment and field any questions. If anyone's unclear about how that relates to SLOs or just more questions about backwards design in general, I'm just gonna leave a minute or two. If you want to type a question in the chat, if you want to speak out loud, feel free. If not, I can kind of continue on.
Noah.
Yeah.
My name is Anna. I mean, you're preaching to the choir, but I think backward design is the way to go. But how can I convince my coworkers that that's the way to go? Because what they will say is like, you're asking me to develop 45 curriculums because I need to adapt to the needs of the 45 students.
Well, what do they do now?
Just deliver one curriculum for everybody. So, and they, like she say, we're starting in page 1 and then go to the page 140.7.
So I think my argument to them would be, you're not actually changing the curriculum, you're kind of changing the lens you're viewing the curriculum through. So what I mean by that is you're taking the curriculum and focusing on what it is do you want to develop from this. So if I start from page 1 and just go to page 50, I kind of lose the overall plan of what it is that I'm trying to focus on. So the benefit of backwards design, I'd argue to them, would be, well, let's focus on what it is in this curriculum, what skills we want to develop. And then as I start going from page 1 to page 50, it gives me a better idea on what aspects of page 3, of page 5 that I want to focus on. Does that make sense?
Yep, I think like you're going to explore your own curriculum like in advance, meaning you're going to be more prepared.
Right.
No, I'm telling you, you're preaching to the choir. I totally follow you, and I really, really would like to have more input from my colleagues, but it's just like, yep, no, I will try that. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even think backwards design is something that is exclusive to education. Like I use it when I'm writing papers. Like I'll think about, okay, well, what it is, what do I want to develop? What do I want to communicate in this paper? Like what questions do I want answered? And then I let those questions kind of guide my writing. I think it's at least to me, it makes a lot of sense on how to kind of go through everything in life. If we talk about, I kind of am interested in habit formation, and a lot of the research behind that is, well, let's make a very specific plan on where I want to go and how to do that, and then my actions will follow, as opposed to just kind of having this general idea, I want to go here, with a lack of kind of nuance and specifics.
Yeah, Noah, can I jump in for a second? Yeah. To pick up on that idea of travel, and I've thought of this as well, like the same thing about a destination. So I teach students that have different experiences in education, and they're not all in the same place. So some of them need more time or something a little bit different. So I think if you were trying to convince someone that backward design is the way to go, it would be a similar analogy. If your outcome is to reach this destination, why can't someone take a car or a train or a bus? And I think that is the key with working on curriculum, is figuring out different ways to let people access that curriculum. If your curriculum is just so narrow that it's like, okay, everyone has to get to this point and you can only take a car. What if someone doesn't have a car? What if somebody doesn't know how to drive a car? And that's the analogy I think of, in terms of designing outcomes and thinking about different types of students and different ways they can access the curriculum and make it work for them. So I don't know if that helps, because I think, yes, they can all get to the same destination and that outcome, but sometimes differentiating the assignments or the tasks or how to get there is the key. And it's kind of like what Shamini's saying in the chat as well. So I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah, but I totally understand. But the problem is that the people will say, other co-workers will say, well, do you want me to buy tickets for a boat? You want me to buy tickets for a train? You want me to buy tickets for a bicycle? I don't have time to do that. I prefer everybody to know how to drive, and let's carpool, and that's it. Because they are stuck in their ways. It's like this sameness attitude that they don't want to change. And I think that's another, not seminar, that's another cultural change that we need to tackle. But I totally understand.
Yeah, I agree, because I've heard similar conversations when people complain or instructors complain like, oh, somebody needs an accommodation. Now I have to do something completely different. And it's a very closed-minded way of thinking. And that I don't have advice for, because it's when people get stuck in that sort of framework, it's hard to convince them otherwise. So
I just want to add one thing. I think everything you've said so far makes sense. What we're up against here is mind change, like changing how the mindset change. And couple of ways I know that it has worked is if it goes ground up, like you start doing interesting things, you get one or two colleagues interested, and just by the excitement around what you're doing and how students are doing, it can help other people think, okay, I can do that too. I think what it is people are afraid of differentiating instruction is a scary term. That means I need a different educational plan for each of my students. That's too much work. And actually, one way to help people do that is to say, no, you don't have to buy tickets for all the different things. But if you create a way of moving that the students can pick on their own. So it's how you design from the very beginning to be very flexible so that you don't have to keep accommodating and differentiating for the little things all along the way. You give people equipment to travel. So that's another analogy, but you're right, Anna. I think there is a whole other webinar in there.
Yeah, that is dealing with a culture change. That I don't know, backwards design can be a piece of that, but that is a approach towards your students, which needs to be changed ultimately.
I agree. Yeah, I agree with Shamini. You can't do a lot about how other people teach. The best you can do is have control over how you choose to teach and lead by example, and hopefully the changes the students are seeing, the evaluations, that evidence will emerge on its own. And like diffusing any innovation, there's always going to be the early adopters, the early majority, the late majority. There's going to be people that never come around.
Yeah. Anna, thank you for bringing that up, because that brings up a just practical, important point to keep in mind. Like, these are sometimes the forces we're up against, and it is important to keep in mind that these are things we have to deal with. So thank you. Okay, so to go back on how to do, so this is kind of when we're kind of at that starting point and you want to identify your desired results, a few things to keep in mind. So I'm going to go over a bunch of frameworks that can help you think about these things more precisely. But I think one of the most important pieces is we want to create outcomes that are meaningful to students beyond the classroom. I mean, if maybe whatever that is. So I think within each topic, we can find a skill that is just helpful in life. But what those helpful skills are is going to depend on who you're serving. So something that I don't think is discussed enough is when we're developing SLOs is to have a clear understanding from the get-go about the age, income, previous experience, and student interest within your class. And then have that in the background when you develop your student learning outcomes. And I think that's a really important piece to keep in mind. So with that said, this first framework I essentially view this as something to have next to you as you're writing your student learning outcome, and almost like a checklist about, all right, I have this, I have this, I have this. And most note, you can kind of read it here, but in general, I think the kind of really important pieces to keep in mind is every student learning outcome should be singular and specific. So rather than having something vague, you want to kind of create something that is getting at one kind of skill you want to cultivate. And then if you want to develop another skill, have that as a separate learning outcome. Measurable and meaningful. Again, I want to reiterate, when we make something measurable, what we're really saying is we want to observe it in some way in the classroom, not necessarily quantifiably kind of assess it. So what I mean by that is, let's say there's kind of a framework that I'll be discussing in a bit that's a more holistic approach to education. And it focuses on kind of developing your students as people. So let's say I want to build confidence in the classroom. Well, that's not necessarily something that's going to organically be able to be assessed when I'm teaching a class, but you can see that growth in a student throughout the semester. So when I say measurable, that can kind of be in a variety of ways. And then the rest of this is just, you want your student learning outcome to be inclusive. So are your students able to complete it in the time frame you have? Is it something that all of your students should be able to achieve? Can they find their interest within that student learning outcome? So again, that goes to being able to achieve that outcome in a variety of ways and building some autonomy, ideally, into your student learning outcome. And again, I think this is one of the better frameworks to kind of just have by your side as you're creating it. The one you will see a lot, and I think this is kind of just more specific if you're stuck. So Bloom's taxonomy, for those that aren't familiar, it's kind of this, well, it was a hierarchical kind of idea. So you either the idea is that you want to cultivate a skill. Do you want them to remember something, understand something, apply, analyze, evaluate, create? And this kind of image just shows a common suggestion is you start off with an action verb. And by doing that, you're creating a kind of measurable, more specific learning outcome. So I think this can kind of just be helpful in kickstarting you. And just another way I think this is a kind of more pleasant thing to look at. So something to keep in mind. I am certainly more partial to this myself, but this is Fink's taxonomy of significant learning, and it kind of breaks up these different dimensions you may want to cultivate in your class. And I think, again, this kind of definitely approaches learning in a more holistic fashion. So when we look at caring and the human dimension and kind of learning how to learn, I think these are not skills that we think about right off the bat when we're teaching a class. But like, I love looking at this and seeing, well, can I build this into my course intentionally? And in that way, I think it's really helpful to look at. The LEAP essential learning outcomes, this is something you will commonly see in liberal arts colleges. Again, definitely, I think, a more holistic approach to education. So this is going to focus on like community engagement, interacting with diverse cultures, expanding yourself beyond just knowledge. And again, all of these frameworks are here to just kind of jumpstart your brain about what you can build in your classroom and where you want to go and what you want to build in your students. None of these are better than the other. It's just kind of which one kind of fits you the best. So I know that's a lot and I kind of sped through it a bit on time, but I want you to just sit with it for a minute or two and think if there's one that speaks to you. Feel free to kind of share in chat or just kind of reflect upon it yourself. But if you want me to go back to the larger images about showing them, please let me know. But just sit with it for a minute or two because they are rich. Okay, so again, like when you're building from the ground up, I definitely suggest having that smarter framework right next to you, and having these just in eyes view, just to give you ideas about what it is that you want to build. Okay, so the next step in this whole process, what does acceptable evidence look like? This is kind of a personal question to you. So I'm hesitant to kind of give specific details, but just these are questions to think about. So you've decided you want to get to X. Well, how does one demonstrate that ability? I mean, a lot of SLOs and developing your course is intentionally thinking through questions and reflecting on them. So you've identified desired results. How do you demonstrate that? How do you observe that in your classroom? How do you see growth? And then the one I will talk about next is, so you've kind of given that some thought. What activities can I create that will allow them to demonstrate these outcomes? And I'm going to provide a resource which I love that may be helpful in that arena. But again, this second, it's just like sitting down and intentionally thinking through these ideas. Because I just know from my own experience, at least when I first started teaching, I was kind of given some SLOs, did not intentionally think through these. And it ended up showing in the results a bit. As I kind of had to reteach that class, it became clear I didn't think about certain topics well enough, and students were confused as a result. Okay, so the last kind of portion to think about is, well, okay, I know what I want to develop. I know what in my mind that may look like. So what type of activities can provide the forum for students to display that? And here is just a quick kind of graph of a chart, I don't know, image, there we go. A quick image that can think about all the different ways, activities you can build into your class that can provide an avenue for students to show these skills. And one of my favorite kind of websites that I actually found through PFF was this Harvard education website. And just to give you an idea of what this looks like. So again, these slides will be available for you to kind of look into more detail. But this website is really, really cool. So essentially you go to the website and you can kind of, this is just a screenshot of it, but you can filter the website through length of activity, subject area, activity type, teach and these award-winning activities as well. And also, which is very specific to us, what learning objective do you want to create? So if you select on that, you get this. So reflect on learning process, learn foundational knowledge, and you get this whole bunch to look at in more detail. And as someone who has wanted to build activities into my classroom, but then my brain just dies when I try to think of what to do, this has been incredibly helpful to just kind of kickstart some ideas. So I would highly suggest going to that website, and you can access it through the slides. But it is a great tool. So quickly, I want to give some examples of what you may commonly see as a student learning outcome and how to improve it. So, sorry, this is psychology specific, something that I'm kind of familiar with. So let's say you see this. Students will understand how to conduct an experiment. Please type in chat, yell, or reflect, whatever you want to do. How would I improve this? And what is the problem with it? What kind of experiment, for sure? That is definitely one of the issues. There we go. Understand does not work. Okay, so what does it mean to understand how to conduct an experiment? Too vague. Can you measure how well they understand how to conduct an experiment? It just doesn't give enough detail. So how would you improve it? This is just one of many examples, but a student will identify a question of interest and convert this into a testable hypothesis. So within that single student learning outcome, we've built in autonomy and interest for the student. So they get to kind of think of their own question and explore it. And then when they convert this into a testable hypothesis, well, as an educator, I can very clearly kind of understand, well, this is testable, this isn't. So we just went from vague to very specific, and it obviously helps the educator to have this level of specificity, and kind of outside institutions as well, to understand what it is you're building. Another one, so student will learn statistical analysis. That's every student's nightmare. What is the issue here? I think this is everyone's lifelong struggle. Good old stats. So, I think we're getting into existential territory now. What type of statistical analyses, what does learning entail? So, if we want to make this more specific, okay, students will be able to conduct an ANOVA analysis in SPSS. All of a sudden, we've told them the avenue in which they can kind of conduct this, and the type of statistical analysis they should be able to kind of complete. So again, it just goes to this point, can you measure it? Is it inclusive? Like, if I'm going to do SPSS, is everyone in my class, do they have ability to use SPSS? Do they have access to it? Have I taught them how to use it? Again, it just goes back to making it specific, measurable, and inclusive in some way. So lastly, and I want to share this link. Okay, so this is putting it all together. I think this is really helpful. So in the PFF course, we kind of use this, and essentially you can see you have your assessment plan, so whatever the assignment you plan to use, indicate whether it's formative or summative, meaning are you building towards something or are you evaluating an end result? That's the kind of difference between those two ideas. What, from the frameworks we discussed, what dimension does it latch onto? And that's just to kind of get some clarity in what it is you're building. Hold on. I realized not everyone. Catherine, can you share that link? I'm stuck in the everyone waiting room. Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. I actually got it. Okay. Sorry, I sent it to the waiting room where no one was. And then in this section, you will have kind of list your student learning outcomes. And I think this is just a document to help you put your class together and have a very clear idea about what it is you're building towards and be very intentional about this process. So with that said, that is pretty much the extent of the webinar. So if you want to get more help on this topic, it is, that is our job to kind of assist you in that. So you can either email us, visit the CGU website and make an appointment. We have a LinkedIn community. We're on Twitter, Instagram, all the social media, all of that. So please feel free to contact us. There are a few different webinars coming up. How to write your teaching philosophy statement, growth mindset for graduate school, which is much needed, and assessing student learning, which I will be running, kind of thinking about how to make student self-assessment part of your class.